Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. For a very long time, Fred Rogers fascinated and comforted entire generations of young children. And there at his side was David Newell, Mr. McFeely, the speedy delivery guy. David is carrying on Fred Rogers' legacy. He says that Rogers got into television at the right time, back in an era where everything was done locally.
They did a lot of news shows, they did sports shows back in the 50s, but no one really tackled a children's show. They came eventually. But usually the newscaster was assigned to do the kids' shows.
Yes.
Something like that.
Or dress up like a sailor on a Popeye show. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it was so funny. In the first station we could watch in Indiana, in the afternoon, it was a Louisville station, Louisville. There was a fellow named Ed Calais who dressed up like an elf, kind of like Bob Troll. And then in the evening, he was on the sports show, and I thought, well, this is kind of funny. It's the same guy.
It was in their contract, I think.
That's right.
And they did everything in those early days. Well, no one, this, remember, is a public television station, the first one. And so Josie and Fred did a live show 1 hour each day for about 7 years. That was a pre
and that'll chew up material.
Boy. And that's why they used films. And when the film would break, it was the old 16 millimeter free films. They put a puppet up and tap dance until they got the film repaired. And now I didn't work on that. I saw that. I would see that in Pittsburgh. It was just went to Pittsburgh. But, you know, this was public television. It was 1954-55. They decided, let's have Daniel Tiger was on that. Let's have Daniel Tiger's birthday and invite people watching to come to the station. Well, they thought they'd have 50, 60 people. They had lines around the block. They didn't know who was watching, and that was the early days of television.
Well, you know, the great story about that is when Howdy Doody was on the air in New York City, and it started as a puppet theater or something before they adopted the name Howdy Doody. They had, it must have been 1948, they had a Howdy Doody run for president. And so they said that they would give a Howdy Doody for president button to any child who would write in. And they produced the buttons based upon the number of TV sets in New York. What they didn't know is that 6 or 7 kids would go to the one home that had the TV set, and they got something like 50,000 requests for buttons. But that was the way they went to Wonder Bread and Welch's Grape Juice and said, we do have an audience out there.
Oh, they do. I don't think that the early days of television they realized. Of course, there was a bigger audience. The pie was bigger. Now the pie is cut up so small.
And with the internet, you got 6 million places you can go.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So to get an audience these days, as you well know, it's tough. Even the big shows, the Tonight Show, over the years, the ratings had fallen. But to answer your question, I got off track. So after 7 years of the Children's Corner in Pittsburgh, someone at the CBC in Canada saw Fred, maybe a Kinney of the show, and said, you know, we've seen you, what you've done. We'd like you to come out in front of the camera and be the host of a children's show. And let's call it Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it was probably more complicated than that, but that's what happened.
And at that time, Mr. Rogers was all one word, if I remember, in the Canadian version.
And neighborhood, it was a U in neighborhood. You know,
the British
that's right.
spelling.
That's right. And we have Kinneys of that also. And so that's how it began. And it ran for 2 years, and Fred decided by that point he had 2 small boys, and he wanted to bring them back to the States and to be with their grandparents and so forth. So, and then another little bit of television history. There was a man by the name of Ernie Coombs who worked with Fred and went to Canada with him from Pittsburgh. And Fred said, well, why don't you give Ernie a show, and I'll go back to the States. Let Ernie host the show. And they started a program called Mr. Dress Up, which became one of the most famous shows for children in Canada. And it ran years and years, too. So Fred spawned that show in a way, too. And then he came back to Pittsburgh, and he started on a commercial station, actually, around the holiday times with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then public television locally saw it and put it on for a couple seasons. And then Sears Roebuck's Foundation.
Yes. God bless Sears.
Yes. They found out about it in some way. Oh, I know. There was a Eastern educational version of it for about 12 cities along the East Coast. And it was going to lose its funding. And there was a Mother's March in Boston back in the late 60s. And they marched and said, "Save Mr. Rogers." It got the national news. Sears saw it and came in and said, "We'd like to help." 24 years they underwrote the show, in part.
Let me back up a little bit before this and educate people as to what Fred was doing before Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He was always tied to music, and was he not at one time working in commercial television with Kate Smith? He was her music director or floor manager.
Floor manager. He went to New York from Rollins College in 1952, I believe. He graduated from college and went to NBC and he called himself a gopher, go for a Coke for the people. And so he did that and worked his way up to a floor manager, which was a prestigious. Is that how you pronounce it? Prestigious?
Yes, important.
Important job. On the track to be a director in a directing program. He was Kate Smith's floor manager, and he worked in the Voice of Firestone, which was music, and the famous Bernstein concerts.
The children's concerts?
Yes, that, and also Bernstein at the time was doing two of his operas, the NBC Opera Theater.
Yes.
And plus others, but they wrote, Bernstein, I think, didn't write that. It was Menotti wrote Amal the Night Visitor.
Amal and the Night Visitors,
and that was strictly written for television. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine them doing that now, an opera for television?
No.
Public television would, but even that is expensive.
Here you have a fellow, talented musician, songwriter, who's learning the craft of television.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
If anyone was qualified to wrap all that together in his own show, it was Fred.
It was. He had the background in music composition from Rollins College in Florida. He had the experience just being thrown into live commercial television, which is, he learned his craft.
At the network level.
At the network level,
yes.
He learned his craft. Fred was a very smart man. He picked things up. He was so quick in picking things up. He had perfect pitch, and he didn't have to use music to play piano. He was quite a musician. He loved it. So that was perfect fit for him. Then one day, getting how he got into. I'm told that, he was also the floor manager of Gabby Hayes' show. Gabby Hayes being Roy Rogers' sidekick.
Ever since Roy and Dale died. I have a friend does the world's best Gabby Hayes. I used to worship the ground Gabby Hayes walked on. What you saw was what you got, I guess, with Gabby Hayes.
That's what Fred said. Gabby Hayes was the live host of Westerns on Saturday mornings on the network. And Fred was the floor manager of those live segments. And during one of the breaks, Fred said, "Mr. Hayes, what do you think when you're talking to all those children out there?" And he said, "Freddie, I just think of that one little buckaroo." In a way, that's what Fred did.
Right.
But then, somewhere in 1953, he heard the WQED was forming in Pittsburgh, the first public television station, and he wanted to be a part of that. And his cohorts at NBC said, "You're crazy. You're leaving NBC to go to a station that's not even on the air in Pittsburgh?" He said, "Yeah, that's what I want to do." So he went and became the first program manager of WQED in Pittsburgh, and then thought about a children's show. And that's how it started. And he had free reign. He could do what he wanted to do, and that's, I think, what Fred always liked, that the neighborhood and public television gave him the opportunity to to not be canceled at 13 weeks if you don't have an audience. It gave him a chance to grow. He loved that.
Well, if you grew up with that show and you watch the continuity of it during the how many years?
Oh, well, let's see. It was
3 decades?
Yeah, or more.
Or more,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Well, it's still on.
But I mean original shows.
From 1967 to 2001, whatever the math is on that. So that's about 33 years maybe.
Yes. You watch the show. It matured, yes, but from the very beginning, this very young, thin fellow in a sweater coming in, it worked from day one, it seems. You see the old original black and whites, and you think, it started out that way.
Didn't change? No, it didn't.
No.
It didn't appreciably change that much, although it did very subtly. For instance, if your listeners haven't seen the show, there's a sort of a screen, a TV screen that shows
picture
it's called, yes. And Fred would say, picture on the wall, show us how crayons are made or something like that to give children an idea. Well, after a while he thought, I don't want children to think this is magic. I want them to know that there's a projector back of that screen. He was just breaking it down. He didn't want to make it seem just all powerful.
Well, I can remember, and I don't know how many years ago it was, seeing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as an adult, and the trolley, and I want to get into that in a minute, because if there were ever a wonderful device in a show, it was that trolley. He moved over, and the camera came in to right where he was sitting down, and he showed the controls for it. And he said the trolley does it, and then Johnny Costa, whom we have to talk about, is going plink, plink, plink on the piano, and the trolley, but Fred's finger's going back and forth. And I thought, Fred, I don't want to know that. I don't want to see that switch that makes the trolley go.
That was your adult perception, probably, seeing that. And I can understand that. But Fred thought in the reality section of the program that should be told. Children should be told that the trolleys can't hear what he's saying. It's pretend, and it's like a train for your listeners who have never seen the program. It's on tracks as a model train would be, but a bigger model train, whatever gauge that is. It's the only trolley in the world like that. It was made in Canada. And the first week before we started taping, the man from the CBC who made it brought it down, and I was in charge of all the props. And I remember him bringing it into the studio, here's your trolley. And it was handmade.
I remember one of the first times you and I talked, a friend of mine was dying of AIDS. And I called up and I said, can I have one of those autographed by Fred? And you shipped it to me. And it was a magic moment when my friend John opened it up. I never will forget that.
The trolley.
Yeah, an autograph replica.
They're available online. By the way, I was telling you that the neighborhood is still on. It is on most public stations, or a good chunk of public stations show it on the weekends. Then it's online. You can see about 70 online any time of the day or night. It's on pbskids.org, and then you search for Rogers. And also Amazon.com. You can buy 300 of them. So they're still available. And the neighborhood lives on. And we're currently working on a program that'll come on PBS. It's called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. And it's based on all the puppets in the neighborhood of make-believe. I mean, it's animated.
How many of the voices of the puppets were Fred?
In the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I'd say the majority. King Friday, Queen Sarah. He did Cornflake, especially X the Al, Henrietta, Lady Elaine, and Daniel Tiger, and Don Quixote.
But in a way, I'm glad you chose Daniel Tiger, because to me, he is the most childlike of all the characters. And I think children can relate to that character.
Yes, that's exactly why he was chosen. Plus, he will be the cardigan-wearing, he'll open each show by taking off an animated, and putting on sneakers, and then riding the trolley to the neighborhood of make-believe where stories will happen and back again. But the stories, instead of being a half hour this time, will be 12 minutes with an interstitial of something related to the stories, and then another 12 minutes. So it'll be 2 individual stories.
You know, you were talking about that speaking one-to-one to child. There was also one other person in the early days of television. That was Frances Horowitz,
Yes.
I think was her name, who also was an educator.
Yes.
Also, she was Miss Frances on Ding Dong School. Now, didn't Fred have a woman who was a child, a psychology
Yes.
advisor?
Yes.
Tell us about how that worked, because I don't think people realize that this was not just your fly by the seat of your pants show. Each show had a message.
Oh, yes, and each show had a lot of research done for it. But before we leave Frances,
Yes.
Fred worked with her at NBC.
Really?
Yes.
That's right. She was at NBC.
And he
had been in Chicago and also in New York.
And I think, well, it was broadcast from New York, I guess, right? Well, he speaks highly of Frances. Miss Frances. I met her once at a conference, too. We were at a children's television conference, and she was there talking about children's television. Wonderful woman. And yes, you're right. But Fred, his sort of, I guess, what would the word be? Master teacher, let's say, was Dr. Margaret McFarland, who taught child development at the University of Pittsburgh. She was the dean of children's play. Play for children is their work, and that was really what she specialized in. But Fred studied with Dr. McFarland, and of all people, Dr. Spock and Eric Erickson. They were all at the University of Pittsburgh in the mid-'50s. And Fred studied with all of them.
What a wealth of knowledge about children. Both psychologically and medically.
Yes. Oh, yes. And Dr. Spock taught at this Arsenal Child Development Center where Dr. McFarland taught. They both produced books, but Margaret never really wrote a book, so she didn't become the household word that the other two did. But she was a dynamo. And every Tuesday, during our taping years, the 30 taping years we did, she would meet with Fred and go over story lines. And she would say, and Fred would say, well, tell me about such and such. And she wouldn't say, well, the book, page 14 says such and such. She would relate a story about a child that she knew. She had wealth of stories. She was the inspiration for a lot of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But Fred would take that academic end of it and put it into words that a child would understand, and then they go back over. Each script was looked over by Margaret.
Now, you say script. I can't conceive of cranking out 5 fresh, difficult, theme-ridden shows a week during this. How much of it was ad-lib based upon where you had to go, or was it all completely scripted?
If your listeners don't know the program, it has Mr. Rogers coming into his television house, and then he goes to the neighborhood of make-believe where the puppets are. You never see him, and then back again. We would do all of the neighborhood of make-believes first in the studio. We would do maybe 3 weeks of those. And then that set would go down, which is the puppet land that people may recognize. And then we'd do the wraparounds. Fred would write everything out on yellow legal paper. That was his script. Then he would give it to the teleprompter person, and that would be put up. During rehearsal, Fred would go through basically what he wrote, but he would deviate somewhat because then he knew where he wanted to go. So it wasn't exactly a memorization on his part, but he knew what he wanted to say. So in that sense, it was scripted. But I'd come in sometimes making a delivery, and maybe we'd get off the script a little bit. But mine was all memorized. It was written out. Here, Mr. Rogers, would you like to see a film about how people make toys? And
what's interesting, the first one you said was crayons, because that's also a Pennsylvania company over in Easton by Philadelphia.
Crayola. Yes, and I think if anybody. The irony to that, there's 2 stories to it, but anybody who remembers how things are made on the neighborhood thinks of the crayons. And here's a subtle change, as we were talking about earlier. Fred would say, let's see how things are made. Let's see how crayons are made. Well, Fred thought, again, he didn't want it to be magic. He wanted children to know that people make these. So from a certain point on, he'd call, let's see how people make crayons. Let's see how people make sneakers, whatever. He always brought it down to a person.
But isn't the whole bottom line of the thrust of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that there is a division between fact and fantasy?
Yes.
And children need to know the difference.
Young children. We're not talking about 10-year-olds. They've sort of sorted it all out. But 3-year-olds don't. In fact, in the neighborhood of make-believe, that's where anything can happen. But when Fred comes in, this theme of the day may be going to school for the first time. So he came in one time with a little school bus, and so when you go to school, he sets it up. Then in the neighborhood of make-believe, the theme is talked about and acted out, and maybe little dramas happen, and then back to Fred at the end of the program, and he sums things up. There was a whole week of going to school, which is very helpful for young children, because it can be very scary.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And I don't know if we even think about that now. We send children off to school. It's changed over the years. Mm-hmm. But I had a friend once who lived across the street from the school, and when she was 5 years old or 6 or first grade, whatever, her father said, "You see that building across the street? That's where you're going tomorrow." That's how she was introduced to school. Wow. I guess he was trying to be helpful.
Well, first day of school, my first day of school, I did not go to kindergarten. Uh-huh. We didn't have it then. But I went in our first grade was in the convent building, which is no longer there. But as I am doing this recording, I can see that building. I know where my first grade class was. I know where I was sitting. I remember Sister Mary Grace. That's a trauma sometimes.
Oh, my, yes, you're right. I remember my first couple days of there's separation. I was an only child, too, so you didn't have that experience of siblings either.
Yes.
You had to go in on your own.
You were a pioneer.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I remember it being something that I didn't want to do. And now, of course, they prep you for school much. But Fred did it on television. It really helped. But yes, he separates fantasy from reality. He thinks that's very important for young children.
For those who have not seen the show, and I can't imagine that there's anyone listening who hasn't, there was a trolley on a track in his house. Uh-huh. And when they would go to the land of make-believe, the trolley would take off and leave and go through the wall.
Right.
And then it would come out the other side of the wall, and suddenly it's all puppets. And I thought that was the most amazing vehicle to move the child from one aspect to another. There was that was a master stroke, getting that trolley there.
And it has a personality too of its own, but it was a transition object, really. Mm-hmm. And Fred used a lot of that to tell a story on television. For instance, the puppets all have a personality of a child, different facet of a child's personality. Daniel, as you said, was shy and retiring somewhat. X the owl always wanted to learn, very curious. King Friday was the authority figure. And Lady Lane always got into trouble.
Yes.
That's the mischief side of children. But every time he wanted to do a story about someone being shy or hesitant or whatever, Daniel would be. And
or meow, 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 Mr. Rogers.
Oh, yes.
Meow. Let's not forget about Henrietta.
That's Henrietta, right. And she would just say meow, meow, meow. And in a way, Fred had a great sense of humor, too. But he never did inside jokes for children. I think it was the purest children's program on television, because what you see with Fred, what you see is what you got.
I have to ask at this point, and I hope I don't open a can of worms.
Okay.
I can't imagine Fred Rogers being a vindictive person, but how did he weather all of those sometimes very nasty parodies that were done of him on television? Insinuating that he was a wimp and all these other things that were, for me, very disgusting. I hated those.
Oh, yes. Well, the first one, the major one, I think, was Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show did one. And my other hat with the show all those many years was public relations. So I called The Tonight Show and said, we need some equal time here, in a sort of a joking way. And they put Fred on. And he came out and talked to Johnny Carson. And, when he first came out, there was they didn't know which way to go. But I think Carson saw that this man is no wimp. That you don't last 40 years or 50 years in television.
No.
But
and if you really want to see the sensitive side of Fred Rogers, there's a clip on the internet of him accepting the Lifetime Achievement Award for television. And when he asks everyone, and I cry easily, he asked everyone to think of the person in their lives who made the biggest difference, and he asked for a moment of silence.
Yes.
It was a magic moment.
Yes, I was there for that event, and they had an audience full of Hollywood notables who
with egos.
Yes. Who their aim in life was to get ratings. And Fred, in some ways, was saying, we in television are purveyors of information. We have to be careful what we send out there.
Before his death, do you think the public adequately was able to tell him how much they cared about him? I like to think he knew we loved him as much as he wanted us to have better lives.
Yes, he realized that it took the first couple of years we were growing, but at some point I realized that this is we're turning into an icon. Fred is the mail is the first. We would never solicit mail. Fred never put the address up right to me, but the letters that would come in are just wonderful. He answered every one. There might be one that send me your picture. He wouldn't. He would have sign the letter, but anything with a very important question or something just heartrending, he would answer. But every letter that ever left, every picture that ever left our offices, he signed and read. He thought the fan mail was the most important thing that we could do for families. He was very family oriented, and that was his concern.
I wanted to know about some of the other adults on the show, and we started talking about the cast members. I mentioned Bob Troll, who was played by a Pittsburgh radio and TV personality, Bob Troll.
That's right.
The way I met you is when I was with the USDA, we wanted to do a show about shipping animals. So I thought, how about get Bob Dog? Well, we had to license him, and I called up, and you answered the phone. And we got Bob Troll to come down to Washington. He was one of the funniest people, easy to work with. And he played Bob Dog in the dog uniform, and then Bob Troll as an elfin kind of guy who had this funny way of talking. Gibberish, yes.
And then he played in the reality segments. He played Bob Troll, who had a workshop. But they would be connected. If Bob Troll, for instance, was repairing a bike in the workshop in the neighborhood of make-believe, he would be Robert Troll riding a bike and doing something. That was the connection. Fred was a musician, as you know, and I think all of the neighborhoods were like symphonies. He would state something. I'm not a classical music.
Theme and variations.
Yes, exactly. They were very structured, very musical. Fred loved music. We did little operas too. We did about 15 operas. Really more musical stories, but did
he write? I know Johnny Costa, whom we still have to talk about. Fred wrote all the music.
He did.
Because I remember I went around singing, "Sometimes people are good."
He wrote all the music.
Do just what they should. And I wanted to get the Fred Rogers songbook, and I never did.
Well, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
And your listeners can get it online if they go into FredRogersCompany.org, frc.org. I was talking about the music.
Yes.
And John Reardon, who was a Metropolitan Opera singer, was in all of the operas. And within the opera world, he was quite well known as one of the finest baritones, who was also a fine actor, too. And he and Fred went to school together.
Oh, wow.
And that's how they met. And Fred's wife, the three of them were in school together, and Joanne Rogers is a pianist, and Fred is too, and Reardon was a singer, and that's how they met. So they stayed friends until John Reardon's death, and then Fred. But Fred Rogers' wife is quite active. She lives in Florida part of the year and Pittsburgh part of the year. She has a son in Florida, a son in Pittsburgh, so she goes back and forth.
Then there was Lady Aberlin.
Yeah, Betty Aberlin, yes. And Betty is an actress who started on Broadway shows. That was her primary occupation, and she ended up in a touring company of the Mad Show, and came to Pittsburgh, and Fred had seen her and asked her to be. We were starting, and so I think she stayed in Pittsburgh for a while, and then commuted. And Betty Aberle, and then
because I remember she was there from very early on.
Yes, in fact, the day I started, Betty was in the corner of the studio rehearsing with Johnny Costa, and I came in the studio and met them at that point.
Now there was a fellow, Chef Brockett.
Yes, Don Brockett.
Did he have an artificial leg?
No, he had, when he was a child, he had. I guess they called it infantile paralysis.
Polio, commonly referred to.
Yes, and he.
Because I often wondered, he just had that little odd movement.
No, he had. That was a result of his polio. He overcame it as best he could. He had operations over the years to straighten his leg, but he always had a slight limp.
Yeah, I hate to remember that one thing about him, but I do remember two things about him. He never looked as if he was acting. I mean, most people on that show didn't. It was very, very conversational. But he's the kind of guy you just wanted to have lunch with. I mean, he just seemed that way.
He was quite a character. Don was, all of the cast members on the program, with the exception of me, were freelancers. I worked full-time around the clock practically with the neighborhood for all those years. And Don was a writer. He did a lot of stand-up comedy on his own with a partner, Brockett and Barbara, they were called. But he wrote some material for Phyllis Diller and some stand-up comedians. He produced a lot of shows, nightclub reviews, things like that. That was his main occupation.
Well, he certainly played an important part in the show.
Yes.
And there's one other fellow I can't pull.
Joe Negri.
Handyman Negri.
Oh, Joe Negri is one of the best guitarists around. He is superb. He and Costa just are incredible. And what's the expression? You're not in your own town or something. You're a stranger in your own town or something. You're not appreciated. I think everybody in Pittsburgh takes Joe for granted because he's been around so much. But he plays with all of the names. He just recorded a record or CD with Michael Feinstein.
Wow!
And then he toured with Michael this summer a little bit, and it's at the Newport Jazz Festival. Joe is a wonderful jazz guitarist, and if your listeners ever want to hear, they can go to Joe Negri, and he has a lot of
Negri.
That's right, Negri, and he's superb. He did also his own composition called a Jazz Mass, and it's on a CD, and he performs it a lot in churches and just in concert. So that's his occupation. He's a musician. He was a musical director of one of the commercial stations in Pittsburgh, and then they would all come and be on the neighborhood. I was there all the time, and I was more involved in production. And then I'd be on camera, too. So I had 2 or 3 hats.
Now, let's talk about Johnny Costa.
Yes.
There's a constant movement of music in that show. And there are little tinkly reactions. And when the trolley moves back and forth as if to say, hello, Mr. Rogers, it's...
Exactly.
I have seen Johnny Costa play. This man had flying fingers.
Oh, he did.
He had to be one of the great, and he looked as if it was effortless.
And he did it all up here in his head. He didn't have to use music. He'd hear it once and he'd have it. Maybe the first time Fred composed something, he'd go over and doodle around with the music. And he'd know it.
I remember seeing him somewhere where he was explaining that how he had to figure out what motif to use, that he could have played it. Tell us about that.
You saw that in Fred Rogers' America's Favorite Neighbor, I believe.
Yes.
And Johnny was, he said, I think he based it on, I'm not sure, I think it was Beethoven. It was
a piece of classical music. The motif for it, yes.
And he demonstrated how he could play it like little, like a children's
music
show.
box kind of
Yes.
thing, yes.
Or he could do variations, and he did the variations. And I wish I could explain it as he did, but he's a genius of the. And it's funny you said Flying Fingers, because that's the name of one of his albums.
Oh,
Flying Fingers. But
when you look at your involvement in that show, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how fortunate you were to have that wealth of talent all come together in one place.
Oh yes, it was. Every so often, as we were taping through the years, I'd stop and think to myself, we had Van Cliburn sitting there one day. He was the guest, and then we had Yo-Yo Ma. And I said, oh, what an experience, the richness. And not only for me, and we were all working for that goal, is the richness it was for children and is for children. Presenting them with the best potpourri of the world, really. At
a time when the arts bands are dying, schools don't have money for a marching band. You and I grew up in an era. Did you go to public or parochial school?
I went to public.
In the parochial school I went to, the wonderful nuns we had, we did something musical, it seemed, every hour.
Uh-huh.
So by the time I got out of school, music was a natural part of my life. And the kids today, some of them have never heard melody.
Oh, I know. And that's the first thing that goes. I think the art program goes first, and they start cutting, then the music, and then down the line. But the football team always stays.
Football team is always there. Yeah, God love them.
But at any rate, Fred was. He loved music. I think that's what. What he didn't like though was the celebrity. He never really wanted to be a famous person. That wasn't his goal at all. It came with the territory. I was in charge of PR, and I would sort of make him walk the plank to do interviews. But he, at the same time, realized it's a necessary evil, too. You have to talk about what you're doing and get on the Tonight Show.
And if he had been a self-promoter, he could have gotten on any show he wanted 5 times a week.
Yeah. And we did a lot of reacting. I did a lot of reacting. People calling and want to interview him. And things from come to speak at our PTA to the Tonight Show. So I would try to parcel it out and use the media to get out our objective, to let people know that this is more than a children's show. It really was. It's not your everyday children's show. I always said that it has such a soul, the depth to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and it doesn't at first glance appear that way. To some adults, I think they had to get used to it. It's not. Sesame Street is a fine show, a wonderful show. I mean, you can't compare them, but you can in the way. And that Sesame is jazzier and a little hipper than the Neighborhood. But now
it's slick.
It's slick. It is, but it's excellent. It's one of probably the best show on television, Sesame, for combining commercial slickness with education.
David, what is the legacy of all of this? When you first got that telegram, come to Pittsburgh, and you started working with Fred Rogers, how long did it take before you realized there's something special here? And what is the legacy of Fred Rogers now?
Well, it took about 2 years to realize that, this just isn't your little television, little kiddie show. A lot of people might think it is, just from seeing it without thinking about it. But when I started to hear some of the songs, and for instance, "What Do You Do With the Mad That You Feel?" It was telling children, and anger. You can be angry. There's nothing wrong with being angry. It's what you do with that anger. You don't hit somebody, and that's in a song. And in some ways, I hope that children hear that, and I think a lot do. Some don't. But it's different. It's different, and Fred had that mission, and permeating the whole program. It was the respect of the individual, the respect of childhood, and I think that's why Fred respected children in childhood, and I think they got that. They couldn't articulate it, but they knew that. That came through the TV set,
and I think that childlike aspect of the character is what most people didn't understand.
Yes.
Because we live in a society now where we almost try to deprive children of their childhood.
Oh, yes,
we want them to grow up too
exactly,
quickly.
and Fred was so against that. You know, the program is not childish; it's childlike. It's a big difference. But I remember one time, Fred, we were doing this little opera, and Fred said, "Oh, we'll just show a child a tuxedo, and I'll wear a tuxedo, and we'll do sort of opera." You know, he said, just sort of tongue-in-cheek. And I was at the tuxedo shop, and I found a little tuxedo for a 3-year-old. And I brought it in to show Fred. He said, "You know, it's cute, but I don't want to put adult symbols on children." That's he didn't want to show that because that's an adult symbol in many ways. That's how he thought. So many examples like that. He was so concerned about, we did something once on pollution, and he had the word pollution. And he thought about it for a while, said, "You know, these children are going through potty training now too." And he said, "I don't want to imply that anything is." That's how he thought. And back to your question, then I started to realize, you know, this is more. One person called him a singing psychiatrist.
I love that.
That was Peggy Charon, who was the head of ACT, Action for Children's Television, who were very influential in getting producers to think about what they're giving kids. But the legacy of Fred, it's so hard to put it in words, but you know, I think the legacy is our letters, and the letters that still come in the reaction I still get. A lot of people tear up when they see me, even adults. It meant so much to them, and I still get thanked. Well, it was really Fred who wrote everything. You should, but I felt I was a spoke in the wheel, but Fred was the driver. But the legacy, and I hope we can continue that. Just, if nothing else, the generations to come respect children and childhood, and we do all we can to help and understand children. You know, I don't think we do totally. I think we take children for granted sometimes. I'm not saying we all do, but I think that's the legacy I hope. Fred hoped that would be the case. You know, these programs, as you said earlier, they're still showing Steamboat Willie, one of the first cartoons of
Disney.
Yeah. These programs could be that way. They are, although they may look a little dated. But at some point, they're going to come back and be in style again, because they're of no particular era, in a way. I call Fred an electronic Dr. Seuss. And in a way, it's like Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz will be shown for as long as we have something
to show it on. Yes.
Wizard of Oz will be around. And I think the neighborhood in many ways is like that. And the other thing, I'll jump back to, you mentioned the factory visits. Just recently, NPR did a story on Mr. Rogers' factory visits, saying, just think, all of the factory visits that he did, we did 200. Many of those are now produced out of the country. They're not produced here anymore. And that was their focus. Whatever happened to all the factories that Mr. Rogers visited? They're now
offshore
somewhere. That Crayola is still here, though, and other. But we did one on tofu. We did one on trumpets. We did one on sneakers, on sweaters, on everything that related to children. And there's also, if you have a local children's museum in your area, there is a traveling exhibit called "How People Make Things," based on the factory visits we did. So look for that.
David, I'm thrilled I finally got to meet you.
Oh, yes, after
all these 20, 30, how many years it's been. Do you have any idea how many times you said speedy delivery?
Oh, boy, if I had a penny, I could retire totally. I don't know, but I use it as a greeting. It's almost like shalom. I think shalom means hello, goodbye, welcome, and all of that.
Kind of like aloha.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
aloha. And I think speedy delivery, I'll say speedy delivery, and it's like hello. We used to do these visits to public television stations where they would invite children to come in to meet Mr. Rogers. And Fred said, I don't want to do a huge auditorium. Let's do in the studio, and we'll have 200 children come at one time, families. And we did 25 shows in one day of it would be a half hour. We'd break and next group and so forth. And we get down to the last one, and I'd hold my finger up and say, one more, Fred, one more. And that became a sort of a communication between the two of us. And in the mornings, he'd poke his head into my office and say, he'd just hold his finger up, and that meant good morning, hello, et cetera, et cetera. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was so quick. And you can see it basically in the children's corners, going way back to the 50s. They ad-libbed most of that. And Fred was so quick. And Josie Carey, who was out front, the Fran Allison character would be out front, and she was wonderful. Great combination. So there's a documentary out called Fred Rogers, America's Favorite Neighbor, narrated by Michael Keaton, because Michael Keaton, the actor, ran the trolley for a while. And
really?
Yeah, he was on our floor crew for about 4 years.
Well, now, wasn't there one other person associated early on with Fred Rogers who now has a completely opposite persona, and is it George Romero?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that. And he's the zombie guy, yet he worked for Fred, right?
Yes, George Romero went to the Carnegie Mellon University, then it was Carnegie Tech, I think, which has a tremendous drama department, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Most of the industry, half the industry seems to have gone through Carnegie Mellon. Well, George did, and we were in production at that time, and George, did a couple of our factory visits. He did a cafeteria showing how the tray goes in and things get washed and that process. And then he did how light bulbs are made. Then he went on, this was 1968, to produce
Night of the
Living Dead. It became
yes.
that was filmed totally in Pittsburgh, and has become a cult classic. But he worked on the show for a while, not a long period of time. But another person worked on the show in the Children's Corner as an intern. His name is Adrian Konauer. And if you know of the movie
Good Morning
Vietnam. Exactly.
And interestingly enough, I know who produced it, Ben Moses.
Oh, he did.
And that's a story about Indiana radio from way back. Yeah.
Well, that's Adrian was on the floor crew of the Children's Corner when he was in, I think, high school and in Pittsburgh, and he then became the subject of Good Morning Vietnam. Robin Williams played in the movie.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was so. There's been a lot of people who've come through the neighborhood over these shows. A lot of people who are now working in Los Angeles as writers and directors and so forth were on the floor crew.
Alumni.
So it's been a wonderful, wonderful ride. It's not over yet. I hope I have another 40 years in the neighborhood, and I want to do my part in helping what Fred started. He was a pioneer. Continue. And, we need Fred to make it exactly as it was, but we don't have him, so we'll do what we can to carry on his legacy and his mission in children's television. And it inspires, I think, producers of adult television, too. It's think about what you're putting on television, how that impacts people. Is a scene that necessary if it's... And I can understand drama. I can understand adults television, and yes, you can have more leeway but think about it at least. But for sure, think about what you're giving children. I think that's very important. And no children. So it's been a long ride, and we're still riding.
David, thanks for joining us.
Speedy delivery.
Make a lot more of them.
Well, I hope so.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.